How's it going, folks? Welcome back to another alternate history scenario. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like afterwards and share it, as well as give me your feedback in the comments. The focus of this video today is the puppet state of Manchukuo. Before I begin the video, I'd like to give a shout out to another alternate history creator, Rewriting History. The idea for this video originated from some suggestions I came up with, hoping to collaborate with him on his video, What If Manchuria Betrayed Japan in World War II? However, by the time I established contact with him, his script was already finished, and thus I never got around to collaborating with him, instead choosing to make my own video. Our two scenarios are completely different, but I still want to credit him, as it was his video that inspired me to make a Manchukuo What If. His channel is linked in the description. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, established in the Chinese region of Manchuria in 1931, is infamous in history for the crimes against humanity committed within its borders. Completely dependent upon its Japanese overlords for its continued existence, Manchukuo crumbled after Japan surrendered in 1945 and lives on only as a horrible memory for the peoples of East Asia. However, today I ask, what if the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo not only survived, but thrived? Before this scenario can be explored, let's take a brief look at the history of Manchukuo, starting with why it was created in the first place. After the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan set its sights on modernizing the nation and building an empire. While the first steps were made by conquering the Ryukyu Islands, Korea, and Taiwan, Japan had long coveted Manchuria, a region located in northeastern China, populated by the Manchus, a Tungusic people who were genetically, culturally, and linguistically distinct from the Han Chinese. After the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, which saw heavy fighting in Manchuria, many in Japan considered Manchuria sacred ground on account of the many Japanese soldiers who died there, and Japan began to feel entitled to Manchuria. However, after winning the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was unable to obtain Manchuria in the peace negotiations, and it remained part of China. But this did little to shake the Japanese resolve to someday conquer Manchuria. In the year 1911, China was thrown into complete chaos as the Republican Revolution inspired by Chinese political philosopher Dr. Sun Yat-sen overthrew the weak and ineffective Qing dynasty, which had been founded by ethnic Manchus, and established the Republic of China in its place. The Manchu imperial family was removed from power, and China entered a period of immense instability known as the Warlord Era. Across China, provinces began to break away from the new government of the Republic of China and came under the control of military leaders known as warlords, who led factions known as cliques. The provinces of Manchuria were no different. In Manchuria, a bandit leader named Zhang Zuolin was able to ascend to power by maintaining good relations with General Yuan Shikai, a Chinese general whose power in the army made him the most powerful man in China for a time after the 1911 revolution. Through smart decision making and good luck, Zhang Zuolin's ability to pick a winning side in the post-revolutionary chaos of the warlord era resulted in him becoming the ruler of Manchuria in 1918 and one of the most powerful warlords of his era. Zhang Zuolin ruled Manchuria along with his group of supporters known as the Fengtian clique. Chinese military support for Zhang ruling Manchuria was not the only factor, however. The Japanese Empire also established a working relationship with Zhang Zuolin, and soon enough, Zhang's Manchuria began to enter the Japanese sphere of influence. Now in control of Manchuria, Zhang Zuolin was able to provide relative stability in an era where the rest of China was in chaos. Promoting noted financial expert Wang Yongjiang to stabilize the economy and advise him on financial and administrative matters under the rule of Zhang Zuolin, Manchuria grew from a backwater to one of the most prosperous regions of China. However, Zhang Zuolin's desire for more power would be his undoing. Not content with governing Manchuria alone, on several occasions Zhang Zuolin attempted to conquer other parts of China, with mixed results. The final attempt saw Zhang's forces capture Beijing. Although he enjoyed success, his military adventures bankrupted Manchuria's still young economy, which was not yet prepared to power a war machine. Soon, Manchuria's economy collapsed. Zhang's allies began to abandon him, strikes broke out across Manchuria, and a revolt against Zhang had to be put down. The last straw came when, in 1928, Zhang's forces in Beijing came under attack by the Chinese National Revolutionary Army, which fought to destroy the warlords and establish a government inspired by the ideals of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, whose original attempt in 1911 had failed and led to the warlord era in the first place. As nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek set his sights on Beijing, the Japanese successfully pressured Zhang to depart Beijing for Manchuria via train. With Zhang en route to Manchuria after the fall of Beijing became all but certain, rogue elements in the Japanese military, which owned the railroad Zhang's train was taking and who were furious with his inability to hold Beijing, planted a bomb on the railroad. The bomb was detonated when Zhang's train passed over it. Zhang was mortally wounded and died on June 4, 1928. The Japanese military leadership in Manchuria, who supported removing Zhang from power but hadn't approved his murder yet, was taken completely off guard by the bombing and left unable to spin the bombing as a Chinese plot on such short notice. With the Japanese clearly behind the bombing, the international community condemned the murder of Zhang, as did the Emperor of Japan himself and the Japanese government in Tokyo. Zhang Zuolin was succeeded by his son, Zhang Zhuiliang, who was an ardent supporter of the Chinese nationalists, in stark contrast to his father. By December of 1928, the nationalist flag flew over Manchuria, and Japanese efforts to formally colonize the region were massively set back as a result of Zhang's impromptu murder. It took 3 more years before Japan was again in a position to colonize Manchuria, but this time around they were more successful. On September 18, 1931, the Japanese staged a false flag attack and detonated a small quantity of dynamite on the South Manchurian Railway. The explosion was minuscule, and the train tracks were undamaged, with the train safely passing over it minutes later. Regardless, the Japanese claimed that this so-called act of insurrection required Japan to take over Manchuria and proceeded to launch a full-scale invasion of the region. Within 5 months of the false flag attack, the Japanese had occupied much of Manchuria. The Japanese consolidated the Chinese Manchurian provinces of Jilin, Heilongjiang, Fengtian, and Shingan to create Manchukuo, a new state in East Asia, with China's Jehol province seized and incorporated by the Japanese a few years later. Shortly after successfully invading and pacifying the region, the Japanese set up a puppet government run by the last emperor of China, Aisin Puyi, who was an ethnic Manchu. Aisin Puyi was invited to be the emperor of Manchukuo to give the new state much needed legitimacy. Focusing on the region's historical Manchu identity, the Japanese crafted a narrative that stated that the Manchu people had been oppressed by the Chinese for centuries, and now the Japanese and Aisin Puyi had stepped in to liberate them. Soon enough, the Japanese had Aisin Puyi crowned emperor, and the Empire of Manchukuo was born. Although its stated aim was to prevent the spread of communism and create a multi-ethnic utopia in East Asia, in reality the Empire of Manchukuo served only to benefit Japan via the exploitation of its resources, its labor, and its strategic location. Manchuria had long been a diverse region, owing to its location at the crossroads of northeastern Asia. Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Russians, Mongolians, and Manchus all called the region home. Although Japan claimed they were building a multi-ethnic utopia in Manchukuo, living conditions for any non-Japanese were abysmal. A joint study by American, Japanese, and Chinese researchers estimates that more than 10 million Chinese workers were used as slave labor in Manchukuo during its existence. Ironically, although Manchukuo was founded with the stated aim of protecting the Manchu people, ethnic minorities such as the Orochen, Evenki, and Nanai, who were closely related to the Manchus, were nearly driven to extinction by the Japanese. In another incident, the deadliest mining disaster in human history occurred in Manchukuo, when the Benji-hu mine in Benji, Fengtian province, suffered a coal dust explosion. The miners who'd toiled there had been slaves, working 12-hour shifts, with minimal clothing, food, water, or sanitation. When the coal dust explosion occurred, to prevent the fire from jeopardizing the rest of the mine, and their profits. The Japanese owners of the mine sealed the lower level where the coal dust explosion had occurred and where 1,549 miners had been trapped. Sealed in by the authorities, the trapped miners perished. Later, it was found that the majority of dead miners had survived the coal dust explosion and instead died from carbon monoxide poisoning after being trapped in the mine. One further fact that illustrates the depravity of the Manchukuo regime is the fact that the Japanese also utilized their puppet state's limited recognition to use it for the manufacture and trafficking of opium, with 90% of the world's opium supply originating in Manchukuo by the late 1930s. All of this is merely the tip of the iceberg, to say nothing of the horrific human experimentation conducted by Unit 731 in Manchuria. For 14 years, this cycle of cruelty and exploitation continued, overseen by the imperial government, the Kuomintang Army, which was a general army of the Imperial Japanese Army, and the Manchukuo Imperial Army, a collaborationist army effectively under the control of the Japanese. The imperial government was mostly staffed by Japanese officials, with a few traitorous Chinese and Manchus working under them, and ran the nation while Emperor Puyi only served as a figurehead who was effectively under house arrest. Meanwhile, the Kuomintang army, while officially present in Manchuria to protect its people from communism, explored the limits of human depravity and cruelty, committing countless atrocities against the innocent people of Manchuria to ensure the region's resources and money kept flowing to Japan. On the other hand, the Manchukuo Imperial Army was infamous for being one of the weakest militaries in the world. The Manchukuo Imperial Army was crippled by abysmal morale, untrained soldiers, and rampant corruption and abuse. The soldiers of the Manchukuo Imperial Army largely consisted of drug addicts and young conscripts who often surrendered when confronted by the enemy. When the Manchukuo Imperial Army was able to function, they were tasked with crushing both the communist and anti-communist freedom fighters struggling to liberate Manchukuo from the Japanese. These three institutions that shaped Manchukuo also defined its three core tenets: lack of agency, needless cruelty, and a complete inability to function. Once the Asian theater of World War II began in 1937, Manchukuo entered the war on the side of the Axis powers automatically when hostilities began. This was due to their status as a Japanese puppet state. During the war, Manchukuo served as a stepping stone from which the Japanese were able to strike out against the Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and the Mongolian People's Republic. Although there were some battles fought along the border Manchukuo shared with Mongolia and the Soviet Union, Manchukuo's primary role during the war was to serve as a base of operations and staging ground for the invasion of China, as well as ensuring Japan's wartime economy and society was kept well supplied with resources from Manchuria. Although some progress had been made in improving Manchukuo's defenses and military throughout the war, when the Soviet Union declared war on the Japanese Empire on August 7, 1945, the end was in sight. 1 minute after midnight on August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union launched Operation August Storm, initiating a massive invasion of Inner Mongolia, Manchukuo, and northern Korea. Operation August Storm would see the Red Army demolish Japanese defenses across Northeast Asia, massacres of civilians by both Red Army soldiers and Imperial Japanese soldiers, and the collapse of Manchukuo, as well as the Japanese colonial administration in Inner Mongolia and in Korea. On August 18, 1945, Emperor Puyi of Manchukuo formally abdicated, and the puppet state that had wrought so much suffering upon the people of Manchuria came to an end. The former emperor was later captured by the Red Army whilst attempting to flee to Japan. His long-neglected wife, the former Empress Wanrong, who had struggled immensely with drug addiction, starved to death while imprisoned by Chinese communist guerrillas. Most of the Chinese collaborators in Manchukuo were executed by the Republic of China government, while the Japanese officials either fled or took their own lives. Manchukuo ended just as violently and horrifically as it had begun. You may, like almost all people, look at the story of Manchukuo and see the story of a hopeless puppet state doomed to fail. And yet, the story of Manchukuo has long intrigued me, as I always wondered what Manchukuo would have been like if it had really been the multicultural utopia Japan claimed it was, instead of the puppet state built on the backs of slaves it was in reality. Today, I pose the question of what if Manchukuo had survived as a truly independent state, separate from Japan? I thought long and hard about how this possibly could have been achieved. Throughout alternate history, there have been three main types of Manchukuo survival what ifs. The first scenario does not technically have Manchukuo survive, but instead, Soviet Manchuria is handed over to the Chinese Communists after the Chinese Civil War is won by the Nationalists, with Manchuria becoming a sort of communist Taiwan, if you will. The second, inspired by strategy games, sees Manchukuo gain effective sovereignty, going on to use the region as a staging ground for unifying China under imperial rule once more. The third and most depressing scenario sees Manchukuo survive in an Axis victory scenario, remaining a puppet state characterized by extreme oppression, violence, and human rights violations. And today we will not be doing any of these. Indeed, any Manchukuo survival scenario presents obvious problems, as the actual Manchukuo government and military were merely extensions of the Japanese government and military. In almost every scenario, simply removing Manchukuo's Japanese rulers would result in its imminent collapse, much like removing a vital organ. The government of Manchukuo was extremely unpopular amongst its citizens, and so even if the government of an independent Manchukuo had enough political infrastructure, economic stability, and military security to be completely independent, it would only be a matter of time before it would fall to a popular uprising. With that being said, here is my idea of how an independent Manchukuo might have been achieved and what it might have looked like. Our point of divergence for this what if scenario occurs in Manchuria during the 1920s, back when it was ruled by Zhang Zuolin. The major change here is a different outcome of the Fengtian clique's internal power struggles. Although the Fengtian clique was already one of the many cliques across China, the clique itself was divided into even smaller factions. The two main factions that fought to control the direction of the Fengtian clique were the Shikan clique, a faction led by Yang Yuting, who promoted intervention in the affairs of other cliques, and the Staff College clique, a faction led by Guo Songling, who opposed military adventurism and instead wished to focus on developing Manchuria. In our timeline, the Shikan clique curried favor with the leader of the Fengtian clique, Zhang Zuolin. At the same time, the Staff College clique was not given any power in Zhang's government, and, feeling underappreciated, it revolted against him, which ended in Zhang crushing the Staff College clique completely. In this alternate timeline, Yang Yuting, the leader of the Shikan clique, is recalled from his military command due to several military failures in the spring of 1921, just as in our timeline. However, unlike in our timeline, where he was merely reassigned, in this alternate timeline, due to his suspicious activities involving the leaders of other cliques, Yang Yuting is deemed untrustworthy by Zhang Zuolin and is executed instead. The death of one military commander who would be forgotten by the world in both timelines would go on to change the history of the world. With Yang Yuting dying in 1921, the Shikan clique never became influential in the Fengtian clique. Instead, the Staff College clique and its leader, Guo Songling, became the influential group responsible for shaping the policy goals of the Fengtian clique. After a loss in a war against other cliques for territory in central China in 1922, Zhang Zuolin, advised by the Staff College clique and his financial advisor, Wang Yongjiang, embarks on a policy of strategic decoupling from China, severing as many ties to the rest of the nation as possible and focusing on developing Manchuria into a fortress for his government and his army. From this point on, for the rest of Zhang's rule of Manchuria, his army would only be deployed as a defensive force against incursions from other warlords. However, this didn't mean that the Fengtian clique was at peace. The Zhili clique, the Fengtian clique's one-time allies turned rivals, had become increasingly supported by the Western European powers, who saw them as the best chance to stop the Japanese from expanding their sphere of influence in Manchuria. Concurrently, the Fengtian clique's pro-Japanese stance also drove public support for the anti-Japanese Zhili clique. Accordingly, the Zhili clique, with their foreign support and funds held over their heads, was coerced into offensives against Zhang Zuolin's Manchuria repeatedly throughout the 1920s. These numerous defensive wars against the Zhili clique resulted in continual Fengtian victories. This led to the weakening of the Zhili clique just as in our timeline, and resulted in the nationalists succeeding against them and reunifying much of China just as in our timeline. With Zhang Zuolin focusing on Manchuria alone, the Manchurian economy is allowed to grow even stronger than in our timeline, guided by Zhang's financial advisor, Wang Yongjiang. Likewise, this results in the Fengtian clique never battling other cliques for control of Beijing, as well as Zhang Zhuolin never embarking on the deadly train ride that ended his life in 1928. This change in the timeline also affects Chinese reunification. Without the Fengtian clique involved in the rest of China, the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, have an easier time reunifying the rest of China, albeit with plans for an invasion of Manchuria in the works. Just as in our timeline, a campaign to reunify China, termed the Northern Expedition, is launched in 1926 and enjoys the same success as in our timeline due to the northern warlords being weakened considerably from constant fighting against the Manchurian Fengtian clique. A major change comes when, instead of conquering Beijing in June 1928, for instance, the nationalists were able to capture it in 1927 as a result of a coup d'etat destabilizing the Zhili clique and leaving them vulnerable to attack, resulting in their defeat during the fall of Beijing and the nominal end of the warlord era. Following the 1927 reunification of China, tension remains between the newly reunified Republic of China and Zhang Zhuolin's Manchuria. On numerous occasions, overtures to Zhang are made by the Republic of China to entice him to abandon his Japanese backers and have Manchuria join the Republic of China, much as his son did after he died in our timeline. However, Zhang, unwilling to give up any of his power, refuses, instructing one of his most trusted generals, the world-famous poet Zhang Zhongchang, to write a strongly worded and foul-mouthed response to the Chinese government in Nanjing, which abruptly ends these negotiations. While some within the Chinese government begin drafting plans for an invasion of Manchuria and the overthrow of Zhang Zhuolin, the breakdown of negotiations with Manchuria and lack of an immediate military response by the Chinese government left many warlords who were defeated in the Northern Expedition with the impression that the new government was weak. This leads to the outbreak of further chaos in China with the emergence of the 1930 Central Plains War, which saw the defeated warlords take up arms against the Chinese government once again. In our timeline, Manchuria, under the leadership of Zhang Zhuolin's pro-republic son, Zhang Zhueliang, stepped in to aid the Republic of China against the warlords. However, in this timeline, with the anti-republic warlord Zhang Zhuolin still in charge of Manchuria, no help is given to the Republic of China. As the Central Plains War intensifies, the Chinese Communist Party, previously a minor player in Chinese politics, begins to grow in power, launching several uprisings and strikes across major Chinese cities as the Republic's government is pushed to its limits. In Manchuria, however, it is a very different story. Since 1922, Manchuria has been developed according to the Fortress Manchuria economic plan and has become a self-sufficient proto-state with a strong, militarized border with China as well as with the Soviet Union. Zhang Zhuolin and his chief advisor, Wang Yongjiang, had managed to create a relatively prosperous society in Manchuria, at least in comparison to China. Beginning in 1927, after the reunification of the rest of China, the Empire of Japan, anxious that a Chinese invasion of Manchuria was imminent, began talks with Zhang Zhuolin about laying the foundation for a Manchurian declaration of independence from China. With Zhang never having been assassinated and Manchuria a stable and prosperous region, the Manchurian proto-government is actually in a position to discuss the matter with Japan as equals, and thus a deal is reached between Zhang and Japan. Concessions to Zhang from Japan include a defensive treaty with Japan stating that Japan would guarantee the protection of Manchuria in the event of an invasion by the Republic of China or the Soviet Union, but otherwise no further Japanese troops would be stationed in Manchuria during peacetime. Another concession is beneficial economic deals with Japan and a guarantee that the Japanese will respect Manchuria's autonomy. A major concession to Japan from Zhang is the form Manchuria's government will take. The Japanese demanded that the Manchurian Declaration of Independence take the appearance of something more significant than a pro-Japanese warlord splitting Manchuria away from China. The Japanese wished for the independence of Manchuria to have a strong, symbolic rationale that would aid Japanese propaganda. Accordingly, the Japanese requested that the last Manchu emperor of China, Eisenjodo Puyi, be installed as the new emperor of Manchuria. Of course, this would merely be a ceremonial position, and Zhang Zhuolin would retain absolute power as the new prime minister of Manchuria. Zhang, who, like Japan, had long maintained good relations with the former imperial family, agrees to this caveat. In public, Zhang Zuolin will bow before the emperor, but behind the scenes, all of Manchuria will be in the palm of his hand. A deal to secure Manchuria's independence was finalized in 1929. However, both Zhang and the Japanese agree to wait until the dust from Chinese reunification settles and the Chinese army downsizes to lessen the risk of a Chinese invasion of Manchuria after Manchuria declares independence. Although Zhang and Japan are confident that Manchuria would win in a war against China, the main concern behind their reluctance for immediate war is keeping the economy of Manchuria in good health. On March 1st, 1930, the Central Plains War erupted across China, and Zhang and the Japanese made their move. Even though the Chinese forces hadn't downsized, the nation being in chaos was even better. That same day, in a speech before tens of thousands of onlookers, Zhang Zuolin declared the independence of Manchuria from China. By his side is Manchuria's new emperor, Eisenjodo Puyi. Zhang declares that Manchuria and the Manchu people have been oppressed for far too long by the Chinese, and now the time had come for them to seize their own destiny. The speech ends with Zhang and the crowd chanting, "Long live the Emperor." 7 days later, Eisenjodo Puyi is crowned the Emperor of Manchuria, and a new nation is born. Manchuria had become the Empire of Manchukuo. In our timeline, after the assassination of Zhang Zuolin, the Japanese had to completely start over their attempts to annex Manchuria, finally realizing their goals after the 1931 invasion of Manchuria, which sent shockwaves throughout China and revitalized calls for national unity. In this alternate timeline, however, instead of a violent invasion, Manchuria is cut off from China with a declaration of independence by a pre existing Manchurian government that has now come under Japanese influence. China, engulfed by resurgent warlord violence and chaos, is unable to even formulate a diplomatic response. Finally, in November 1932, 2 years later than in our timeline, the nationalists of the Republic of China managed to eke out a win against the warlords, and the Central Plains War ended in a government victory. But this victory is a Pyrrhic one, as the government was forced to concede more power to the warlords, weakening it considerably. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Republic, had lost much of his political power in the struggle, as many in China began to look to other leaders. Worst of all, the Chinese Communist Party had capitalized on the chaos, growing more powerful much earlier than in our timeline. With the anti-communist nationalists on the ropes, the encirclement campaigns, which, in our timeline, eventually sent the Chinese Communists on the run, never materialized, resulting in the Chinese Soviet Republic, an unrecognized state in China's Jiangxi and Fujian provinces that was crushed by the nationalists in 1934, surviving into the mid 1930s instead, which is only one of the Chinese government's numerous problems. Meanwhile, in Manchukuo, the 1930s are a decade of change and upheaval. In our timeline, Manchukuo briefly experimented with actually trying to form political institutions that reflected its stated purpose of establishing a multi-ethnic utopia, such as the Pan-Asianist Concordia Association. But these institutions were soon subverted by the Japanese military and Manchukuo puppet government, which transformed them into hollow vessels only functioning in tandem with the authoritarian government. In this alternate timeline, however, these institutions have a chance to actually develop, at least for a time. The worst human rights abuses that occurred in our timeline's Manchukuo were avoided thus far because the Japanese were not yet in full control, instead exerting influence through the Zhang Zuolin government. 1931 saw the establishment of the Legislative Council, a unicameral legislature that was subservient to the office of the Prime Minister, which was little more than a cover for Zhang Zuolin's dictatorship. Under the leadership of Zhang Zuolin and Deputy Prime Minister Wang Yongjiang, who also served as the Minister of Finance, Manchukuo's economy continued to grow even during the Great Depression, thanks to the fact that they were isolated from the world economy as a result of the League of Nations deeming Manchukuo an illegitimate state. However, this economic growth did not come fast enough for Japan, who increasingly attempted to pressure Zhang Zuolin to institute slavery in Manchuria, even when workers' rights were already abysmal. Zhang was able to resist this pressure for a time, but this first conflict with Zhang, along with the rumor that Zhang Zuolin was grooming his son, Zhang Zuoliang, to be his successor, leaves the Japanese planning contingencies for his removal from power. Likewise, soon enough, Zhang Zuolin begins to realize that the Japanese, contrary to his initial impression of simply wanting a firm ally in mainland Asia, plan to use Manchukuo as a base of operations from which to conquer all of China, endangering his rule and the prosperity of the region. Quietly, relations between Manchukuo and Japan have begun to deteriorate. And that's where we'll be leaving things for today. Stay tuned for part 2, coming out soon.